My 70-year-old husband left me for his first love. I stopped their wedding with 3 truths. The late afternoon light spilled through the lace curtains, casting intricate shadows across the hardwood floor of the living room. Margaret sat on the edge of the worn velvet armchair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if holding herself together. The house, once filled with the clamor of family dinners and children's laughter, now felt like a hollow shell. She stared at the framed photo on the mantelpiece, her and Henry on their 25th anniversary, smiling under a willow tree. That was 15 years ago. Now, at 70, her world was unraveling. Henry stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the fading sun. His shoulders, once broad and reassuring, seemed to carry a new purpose, one that excluded her. "Margaret," he said, his voice steady but devoid of warmth, "I'm leaving. I want a divorce." The words landed like stones in a still pond, rippling through her chest. She blinked, her breath catching. "What?" she whispered, though she'd heard him perfectly. He turned, his gray eyes meeting hers for the first time that day. "Eleanor's husband passed away last month. She's free now, Anne. I've always loved her. You know that." Eleanor. The name pierced Margaret like a forgotten splinter. Henry's first love, the woman he'd courted before Margaret entered his life. She'd heard the stories, whispered regrets during late-night arguments, a name that lingered like a ghost. But to hear it now, after 4 decades of marriage, was a betrayal that burned. Margaret's mind reeled, pulling her back to the early years. She saw herself at 25, scrubbing dishes in their tiny apartment while Henry studied late into the night for his engineering degree. She'd worked double shifts at the diner, her hands raw from bleach, to pay their bills. She'd mended his shirts, cooked his meals, and raised their daughter, Sarah, through sleepless nights and fevered days. All the while, he'd called her simple for never finishing high school, his words cutting deeper than she'd ever admitted. "You're not like Eleanor," he'd said once, half drunk, "she's got a mind for books." Margaret had swallowed the hurt, believing her devotion would be enough. Now, standing in their living room, she felt the weight of those sacrifices. "You're throwing away 40 years for her?" Her voice trembled, but there was steel beneath it. Henry's jaw tightened. "It's not throwing away. It's reclaiming what I lost. We're meant to be together, Margaret. The world's saying so." He gestured vaguely toward his phone on the coffee table, its screen glowing with notifications. She frowned, confused, and picked it up. Her fingers, still nimble despite her age, swiped through a flood of messages and posts. Henry and Eleanor's reunion had gone viral, a saccharine story of lost love found again, shared across social media with heart emojis and teary captions. Strangers called it destiny. To Margaret, it was a public humiliation. Her heart pounded as she set the phone down, its clatter loud in the silent room. "And what about me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry looked away, his silence an answer. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in with memories of her life's work, every scrubbed floor, every birthday cake baked, every tear shed for this family. She thought of Sarah, their daughter, now a polished lawyer in her 40s. Would she understand? Or would she, too, see Margaret as the obstacle in her father's fairy tale? Margaret rose, her knees unsteady, and walked to the kitchen. The familiar creak of the floorboards grounded her. She filled the kettle, the ritual of tea a small anchor in the storm. As the water hissed, she stared out the window at the garden she'd tended for decades, roses she'd coaxed through harsh winters, lavender that scented the air. This was her domain, her legacy. Yet it felt fragile now, as if Henry's words had uprooted it all. She wondered what Eleanor's garden looked like. Did it bloom with the elegance Henry craved? Or was it as hollow as his promises? The kettle whistled, snapping her back. She poured the steaming water, the mug warming her hands. Henry's footsteps approached, hesitant. "I'll move out tomorrow," he said, lingering in the doorway. "We'll sort out the details later." Details. As if their life could be reduced to paperwork. She didn't turn to face him. "Just go," she said, her voice flat but firm. He lingered a moment longer, then left, the front door clicking shut behind him. Alone, Margaret sipped her tea, the bitterness mirroring her thoughts. The viral posts gnawed at her, strangers celebrating her pain, oblivious to her story. She set the mug down and walked to the mirror in the hall. Her reflection showed a woman weathered by time, silver hair pulled into a neat bun, lines etched around her eyes from years of laughter and tears. But there was strength in her gaze, a flicker of defiance. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with evening life, children's laughter, the distant bark of a dog. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the sounds anchor her. She didn't know what came next, but she knew one thing: she would not let Henry and Eleanor's story erase her own. Not without a fight. The banquet hall shimmered under crystal chandeliers, their light fracturing into 1,000 glints across polished silverware and wine glasses. Margaret stood at the edge of the room, her navy dress, chosen carefully from her modest wardrobe, feeling like armor too thin for the battle ahead. She'd come to Henry and Eleanor's wedding seeking something intangible, closure, perhaps, or a glimpse of the man she'd once loved. Instead, she found a spectacle. Tables draped in ivory linens groaned under platters of roasted quail and tiered cakes, while guests in tailored suits and sequin gowns buzzed with excitement. The air carried the scent of jasmine and ambition, a heady mix that made Margaret's stomach churn. She lingered near a towering floral arrangement, its lilies almost overpowering, and watched Henry and Eleanor at the center of the room. Henry, in a crisp tuxedo, laughed with a warmth Margaret hadn't seen in years. Eleanor, radiant in a cream gown that clung to her slender frame, leaned into him, her auburn hair catching the light. They were the picture of a storybook romance, their viral love story fueling whispers among the guests. Meant to be, someone murmured nearby. Margaret's fingers tightened around her clutch, the leather creaking under her grip. Meant to be, at the cost of her life's work. Her thoughts churned, a tempest of grief and fury. She'd spent weeks wrestling with Henry's betrayal, each night replaying his cold dismissal in their living room. She'd come here not to disrupt but to understand why her sacrifices, her steadfast love, had been so easily discarded. Yet standing in this glittering hall, she felt like a ghost, invisible to the revelry. The injustice of it clawed at her, urging her to act, to reclaim her place in a narrative that had written her out. Sarah's approach shattered her reverie. Her daughter, sleek in an emerald dress, her lawyer's poise unmistakable, stopped before her. Margaret's heart lifted briefly, perhaps Sarah, at least, would offer solace. But Sarah's eyes were hard, her lips a thin line. "Mother," she said, her voice low but cutting, "you shouldn't be here." The word struck like a slap. Margaret's breath hitched. "I'm still your father's wife," she replied, her tone steady despite the tremor in her chest. Sarah's gaze didn't soften. "You were the wedge between them 40 years ago. You knew he loved Eleanor. Why can't you let him be happy now?" The accusation was a blade, twisting in Margaret's gut. She saw flashes of Sarah as a child, clinging to her skirts, giggling over bedtime stories, now replaced by this stranger who saw her as the villain. "I gave everything for this family," Margaret said, her voice rising, drawing a few curious glances. Sarah stepped closer, her whisper venomous. "You held him back. Eleanor was his equal, not you. Just leave, Mother. Don't ruin this." She turned, her heels clicking as she rejoined the crowd, leaving Margaret rooted, her heart a tangle of hurt and rage. The room seemed to tilt, the chatter and clinking glasses a distant hum. Margaret's eyes darted to the head table, where Henry raised a glass, his arm around Eleanor. The sight ignited something primal in her. She wouldn't, let their story erase hers. Her feet moved before her mind caught up, carrying her toward the microphone at the front of the room. The band paused, and a hush fell as she grasped the stand, her hands trembling but resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear, slicing through the silence. Heads turned, eyes wide with curiosity. Henry froze, his glass halfway to his lips. Eleanor's smile faltered. Margaret took a breath, her pulse thundering. You've all heard the story of Henry and Eleanor, the lovers reunited. But there's a part they left out. Her words hung heavy, each one a stone she'd carried too long. For years, while Eleanor was married to another man, she and Henry carried on an affair. Behind my back, behind her husband's. This isn't a fairy tale, it's a betrayal. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman dropped her fork, the clatter echoing. Henry stood, his face flushed, stammering, "That's not true." Eleanor clutched his arm, her eyes darting to the guests, who whispered furiously. Margaret pressed on, her voice unwavering. "I gave 40 years to a man who lied to me, who belittled me, who planned to discard me the moment she was free. You celebrate their love, but what about the lives they broke to get here?" The room was a storm of murmurs now, phones discreetly raised to capture the moment. Margaret's chest heaved, her truth laid bare. She looked at Henry, expecting shame, but saw only anger. Eleanor's face was a mask of panic, her elegance unraveling. Sarah, standing near the back, stared at her mother, her expression unreadable. Margaret set the microphone down, the click resounding in her ears. She turned and walked out, her steps deliberate, the cool night air greeting her as she pushed through the doors. Outside, the stars burned brightly above the manicured gardens. Margaret paused, her breath visible in the chill. Her heart pounded, not with fear but with a strange exhilaration. She'd shattered their perfect narrative, and though the cost was steep, Sarah's rejection, the public spectacle, she felt alive. The weight of silence she'd carried for decades had lifted, replaced by a spark of defiance. Whatever came next, she would face it as herself, not as Henry's shadow. The morning after the wedding, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the chipped ceramic mug of chamomile tea cooling untouched before her. Sunlight streamed through the window, gilding the dust motes that danced in the air, but the warmth couldn't reach the chill in her bones. Her outburst at the banquet hall replayed in her mind, each word a spark that had set her world ablaze. She'd expected regret, perhaps shame, for disrupting Henry and Eleanor's moment. Instead, she felt a quiet ferocity, like a river carving stone, relentless and unapologetic. She'd spoken her truth, and now the world was listening. Her phone, an old model Henry had mocked for its cracked screen, buzzed incessantly on the table. Notifications piled up, messages from strangers, comments on a video she hadn't yet seen. Curiosity tugged at her, though dread lingered. She unlocked the device and found a clip, posted by an anonymous guest, capturing her speech. Her voice, steady and raw, echoed through the tiny speaker, her silhouette stark against the glittering backdrop of the wedding. The caption read, "The truth behind the viral love story." It had thousands of shares, each comment a thread weaving her pain into a tapestry of public outrage. "She deserves better," one wrote. "What a betrayal," said another. Margaret's throat tightened. For the first time in years, she wasn't invisible. Emboldened, she opened her laptop, its keys worn from years of budgeting spreadsheets and recipe notes. Her fingers hovered, then typed. She poured her story into a video script, every sacrifice, every slight, the affair she'd uncovered through years of hushed phone calls and Henry's late nights. Sitting before her phone's camera, she spoke plainly, her silver hair catching the light, her eyes fierce with resolve. "I'm Margaret," she began, "and this is what they didn't tell you." She uploaded the video to a platform she barely understood, her heart racing as the progress bar ticked to completion. Within hours, it spread like wildfire, her voice reaching corners of the world she'd never seen. Henry's response came swiftly. He appeared at her doorstep that evening, his face haggard, the charm of the wedding night gone. The porch light cast harsh shadows across his features, aging him beyond his years. "Margaret," he said, his voice tight, "this has to stop. You're ruining everything." She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, the scent of her lavender garden drifting between them. "Ruining what?" "Your lie," she shot back, her tone sharp but calm. He thrust a folder at her, legal papers, a settlement offer. "Take this. 300,000. Just retract your video and stay quiet." The sum was staggering, a fortune for a woman who'd pinched pennies her whole life. But it felt like blood money, a bribe to erase her existence. She pushed the folder back. "I'm done being silent, Henry. You made your choice. Live with it." His eyes narrowed, a flash of the man who'd once called her simple. "You'll regret this," he muttered, turning into the dusk. Margaret closed the door, her hands trembling not with fear but with clarity. She wouldn't be bought. Not anymore. The backlash came not from Henry but from Sarah and Eleanor. By morning, their videos surfaced online, polished, calculated. Sarah, her lawyer's poise intact, called Margaret's claims bitter exaggerations from a jealous woman. Eleanor, her writer's eloquence on display, painted herself as a victim of circumstance, her affair with Henry a regrettable lapse, long past. Their words stung, each one a barb aimed at Margaret's heart. She sat in her living room, the same room where Henry had shattered her, and felt the weight of their betrayal anew. Sarah's rejection cut deepest, her daughter, her flesh and blood, choosing a narrative that erased her mother's pain. But the tide turned unexpectedly. Thomas, the nephew of Eleanor's late husband, emerged from the shadows of the internet. His post was simple, devastating, scanned letters, dated years ago, in Eleanor's elegant script, confessing her love for Henry while her husband lived. "My uncle deserved better," Thomas wrote. "So does Margaret." The evidence was undeniable, each word a nail in the coffin of Eleanor's carefully curated image. Comments flooded in, hashtags like #JusticeForMargaret trending. Margaret read them in her garden, the roses she'd tended for decades blooming fiercely around her. She felt a swell of gratitude for Thomas, a stranger who'd seen her when her own family hadn't. Inside, she paced, her mind a whirl of what-ifs. She could have taken Henry's money, retreated to the countryside, and lived quietly. But that would mean surrendering her voice, her truth. She thought of the women in the comments, mothers, wives, daughters, who saw themselves in her story. Their support was a lifeline, pulling her from the abyss of doubt. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. As night fell, Margaret stood at her window, the stars a quiet witness. The world had turned her pain into a cause, her voice into a beacon. She didn't know how far this would go, but she knew one thing: she was no longer the woman who'd stood silent. She was Margaret, and she was just beginning. The autumn air carried a bite as Margaret stepped out of the lawyer's office, the weight of a signed settlement in her hands. $300,000, Henry's final concession after weeks of legal wrangling, was hers, not as a bribe but as a hard-won acknowledgement of her worth. The city street hummed with life, honking taxis, the chatter of pedestrians, the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby cart. Yet Margaret felt detached, as if the world moved around her while she stood at its edge, clutching a victory that tasted bittersweet. The money was freedom, yes, but it couldn't erase the scars of betrayal or mend the rift with Sarah. Back home, she sat at her dining table, the settlement papers spread before her like a map to an uncertain future. Her fingers traced the numbers, each zero a testament to her fight. She'd refused to be silenced, and now the world was turning against Henry and Eleanor. Online, the tide had shifted decisively. Eleanor's books, once celebrated for their lyrical prose, vanished from bookstore shelves, her publisher citing public sentiment. Social media was merciless, memes mocked her as a homewrecker, while op-eds dissected her hypocrisy. Margaret scrolled through the posts on her phone, her heart a tangle of vindication and unease. She hadn't wanted to destroy Eleanor, only to be seen. Yet the ferocity of the backlash was a force she couldn't control. Henry fared no better. Once a respected engineer, he now faced whispers at the golf club, cold shoulders at community events. Neighbors who'd once clapped him on the back now crossed the street to avoid him. Margaret overheard snippets at the grocery store, gossip about his shameless affair, his poor wife. She wanted to feel triumph, but instead, a quiet sorrow settled in. She'd loved him once, built a life with him. Seeing him reduced to a pariah stirred a flicker of pity, quickly smothered by the memory of his cruelty. Sarah's downfall was the hardest to witness. Her law firm, embarrassed by her public defense of Eleanor, let her go, citing reputational concerns. Her face, once poised in glossy headshots, now appeared in tabloid headlines, her career unraveling alongside Eleanor's. Margaret learned this not from Sarah but from a news alert, a cold reminder of their estrangement. She sat in her armchair, the same one where she'd first heard Henry's betrayal, and wondered where her daughter was now. Was Sarah alone, nursing her wounds? Or still clinging to Eleanor's sinking ship? The thought of Sarah's pride, her fierce, unyielding loyalty to Henry, twisted like a knife. Margaret longed to reach out, to bridge the chasm, but fear held her back. What if Sarah rejected her again? Amid the chaos, Margaret's mind turned to the future. The settlement was a chance to reclaim her life, to build something untouched by Henry's shadow. She'd always dreamed of a farmhouse restaurant, a place of warmth, where her recipes, honed over decades, could bring people together. The idea had lingered in the margins of her life, dismissed as impractical by Henry, who'd scoffed at her kitchen hobbies. Now, it felt like a calling. She spent evenings sketching plans on yellow legal pads, her handwriting bold and sure. A rustic dining room with oak tables, a garden for fresh herbs, a menu of hearty soups and pies, she could see it, vivid as a memory. One crisp morning, she drove to a real estate office, her heart pounding with purpose. The agent, a brisk woman with a warm smile, showed her listings for rural properties. Margaret's eyes lingered on a weathered farmhouse an hour outside the city, its stone walls nestled among rolling hills. The price was within reach, thanks to the settlement. Standing on the property, she inhaled the scent of damp earth and wildflowers, the silence broken only by birdsong. This was her place, her beginning. "I'll take it," she told the agent, her voice steady, a smile breaking through years of restraint. As she prepared to leave her old home, Margaret packed sparingly, choosing only what felt essential: her grandmother's quilt, a box of recipe cards, a photo of Sarah as a child, her grin gap-toothed and fearless. Each item was a thread to her past, but she packed them not with nostalgia but with resolve. She was shedding Henry's world, not her own. The house, soon to be sold, felt like a stranger's now, its walls no longer hers to tend. Online, the storm around Eleanor and Henry raged on. A late-night talk show host cracked jokes about their fairy tale gone wrong, and Margaret caught herself laughing, a sound that startled her with its lightness. She wasn't gloating, she was healing. The world's judgment wasn't her doing, it was the consequence of their choices. She thought of Thomas, the stranger who'd tipped the scales with his evidence. She'd sent him a thank you note, simple but heartfelt, and his reply, a brief, kind message, had warmed her. There were still good people, she realized, who saw truth and acted. As she locked her front door for the last time, Margaret glanced at the garden she'd loved. The roses would bloom for someone else now. She climbed into her car, the farmhouse's address programmed into her GPS. The road ahead was unknown, but it was hers. For the first time in decades, she felt the thrill of possibility, a spark that burned brighter than her pain. The farmhouse stood sturdy against the dawn, its stone walls bathed in the soft pink of early light. Margaret leaned against the porch railing, a mug of coffee warming her hands, its steam curling into the crisp autumn air. Beyond the rolling hills, mist clung to the valley, and the scent of dew-soaked grass mingled with the rosemary she'd planted by the steps. Her restaurant, named Hearth and Haven, had opened 3 months ago, its oak tables now polished to a gleam, its windows framing views of her thriving herb garden. At 70, Margaret had built something entirely her own, and the weight of that truth settled in her chest like a long-held breath finally released. Inside, the kitchen buzzed with quiet purpose. She kneaded dough for her signature sourdough, her hands moving with the rhythm of decades, each motion a meditation. The restaurant was more than a business, it was a sanctuary. Locals and travelers filled the tables nightly, drawn by her roasted vegetable soups, her apple tarts dusted with cinnamon, her warmth that made strangers feel like family. She'd hired a small staff, Lila, a young chef with a quick laugh, and Tom, a waiter who charmed with his stories. They called her Miss Margaret, their respect a balm to wounds she'd carried too long. Yet, as she shaped the dough, her thoughts drifted to Sarah, a shadow that lingered despite her joy. Margaret had heard whispers of her daughter's struggles. Sarah's once glossy life had unraveled, her social media silent, her name absent from legal circles. A mutual friend mentioned Sarah had moved to a small apartment, scraping by on freelance work. Margaret's heart ached, torn between the urge to reach out and the fear of another rejection. She pictured Sarah's face at the wedding, cold and unyielding, and wondered if her daughter regretted those words. For now, Margaret poured her love into her work, hoping time might soften the rift. The restaurant's success surprised even her. A food critic from the city had visited unannounced, her review praising the soulful simplicity of Margaret's dishes. The article, clipped and framed by the counter, drew crowds from miles away. Each night, as she lit candles on the tables, Margaret felt a quiet pride. This was her legacy, not Henry's or Eleanor's, but hers alone. She'd transformed the settlement money into a dream, proving to herself, and the world, that she was more than the simple woman Henry had dismissed. One evening, as the last patrons lingered over coffee, a familiar figure appeared at the door. Thomas, the nephew who'd exposed Eleanor's letters, stood hesitantly, his coat dusted with frost. Margaret's face lit up. "Thomas," she exclaimed, crossing the room to greet him. "What brings you here?" He smiled, shy but genuine. "I was passing through, saw the sign. Had to see what you'd built." She led him to a table, insisting he try her pot pie, and they talked as the fire crackled nearby. He spoke of his uncle, a kind man broken by Eleanor's betrayal, and of his own relief at seeing justice done. Margaret shared snippets of her journey, the fear of starting over, the thrill of her first busy night. "You gave me a chance to be heard," she told him, her voice soft. "I'll never forget that." Thomas nodded, his eyes warm. "You did the rest, Margaret." Their conversation lingered in her mind as she closed up, the stars blazing above the farmhouse. She thought of the women who'd written to her, inspired by her story, and the customers who left notes thanking her for a meal that felt like home. Her life, once defined by sacrifice, now bloomed with purpose. Yet, as she swept the floor, a pang of loneliness surfaced. She missed Sarah, not the woman who'd scorned her, but the girl who'd once run to her with scraped knees and secrets. Margaret set the broom aside and pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over Sarah's number. She typed a message, "I'm here if you need me. Hearth and Haven, anytime." She hesitated, then sent it, her heart racing. No reply came, but the act felt like a seed planted, one that might grow in time. The next morning, Margaret walked her garden, clipping thyme and sage for the day's menu. The earth felt solid beneath her feet, grounding her in a way the city never had. She thought of Henry and Eleanor, their lives dimmed by their own choices, and felt no anger, only distance. Her world was here, among the hills, the laughter of her staff, the clink of dishes. She was no longer the woman who'd begged for Henry's approval or Sarah's love. She was Margaret, whole and unyielding, her story written in every loaf baked, every table set. As the sun climbed, she stood at the edge of her property, the horizon stretching wide. A customer's car pulled up, the first of many. Margaret smiled, her apron dusted with flour, and turned toward the farmhouse. The day was hers to shape, and she was ready.